Hello, I'm Kyriakos Gold and welcome to Think Greek. Join me in this episode to talk about the women of the revolution with Vicky Paparchristos and Faye Spiteri.
Forget about any man trying to get a board position these days. They're all going to the women, and I know that's rubbish.
I'm not, a woman of colour or an Asian woman or, you fit a particular thing. Is that bother me? No.
It really makes me want to shrink back and go, how have I contributed to that behaviour and what have I done to change that behaviour?
I think around the world, even for the people that they came here in Australia as for a better life, they were looking for opportunities. So I think it's a very important word.
Multiculturalism was built with the premise of a utopia.
I think it's cool to be Greek today. A lot of Greek women are really proud of their identity and they're really, really good.
Γεια σας, I'm Kyriakos Gold and this is Think Greek. Today we're talking about the women of the revolution and today I have with me Vicky Paparchristos and Faye Spiteri. We spoke about women yesterday briefly. We're not going to go through the whole history of the revolution, but what we took from last night was that women were commodities. They were invisible, they were traded like slaves. However, some of them excelled. They were never recognized in the new Greek state. They were recognized later. Let's see what Dean Kalimniou said about women of the revolution in our first episode.
Bouboulina and Mavrogenos were two women who were lionized by the Greek community and by Greek historiography and were treated deplorably. Bouboulina was assassinated because her son had the temerity to marry the daughter of a leading land baron on the island of Hydra. Mandor Mavrogenos has devoted all of her family resources to equipping ships for the Greek Revolution. Her love life was paraded for all to see. She was, I'll call it, she was slut-shamed. Yeah?
How do you feel 200 years later? Do you feel women are celebrated now in Greece? Do we need a revolution? What do you think?
I'll probably always need a revolution. And I don't know that they are celebrated as much as they should be. And there are some that are celebrated, like if you look back into the more recent past, we've had some extraordinary actors and musicians that are hugely celebrated, but they were hugely successful as well, like Maria Callas, Melina Mercouri, Nana Mouskouri, she's known globally. She sings in 15 different languages. So they have been celebrated, but there are many more. And from the revolution, there's only a few that I could talk about or would know about. So I don't think they have been celebrated.
Faye?
I agree. And I suppose it's, that confluence of understanding who the heroes of that War of Independence were. And if you look back at the history of the women that are recognised, it's very much women who were wealthy, independent in their own right to some degree, and especially for that time and place. And I guess it's when you reflect on history, it's always about the perception of the people writing that history. And you mentioned the history of the First Nations people of Australia and growing up, what did we learn about that history? And I think it's the same with the women of the revolution and their history. It's who wrote that history and what details, were recorded for that history to be recorded. And then that second part of your question, how does that translate to Greece today or Greek Australian women today? And I think there are things you inherit consciously, subconsciously around the boldness of the bravery and courage and passion of women to create change. Are there women who are standouts. Yes, there always are. How you describe them in terms of their bravery and heroes, I think always depends on who's telling the story. So I think you can take famous women because we know their stories and they become examples and heroes for the everyday woman who I believe are the real heroes, because they are the ones that are committed every day to making a difference and making change, but they're inspired by, you know, what they hear and see and read of women of, you know, that have come before and the legacy that they've created.
So, την ιστορία τη γράφει ο νικητής. The winner takes it all.
Yes, I think so. I think it's, I mean, you see it, like I mentioned, with our own history and what does that mean. And it's all about perception and facts, because facts in whose eyes? You know, facts in how, you know, and you see a lot of history that is being rewritten, like the Black Lives Matters movement in America. That's all about rewriting that history from the perception of the lived experience of people who have been oppressed or, you know, victims. And I think in this case, it's the same. The women who fought for independence were very brave, and their stories weren't necessarily, you know, recorded in the way that potentially, you know, the male stories were, or the male heroes, but I don't think they ever are, because it's, you know, who holds the pen, you know, who is writing those stories. And you, throughout society and even to today, obviously we have great gender inequality and great gender imbalance. It doesn't mean women can't raise their voice, and obviously it's happening more and more, but I think everything is cyclical. So you reach points at which, for example, like in the 70s, where women, you know, really fought for women's rights and liberties on a whole range of issues, and the freedoms of which we enjoy today.
The 4 stages of the pressure cooker, the
yes,
first wave of feminism.
But you see, you know, that, you know, over centuries, you know, that those cycles move in certain ways depending on the society that we live in, I believe.
I'm going to go a step back. So the wealthier women had the option to educate themselves and maybe contribute till they got married. The poorer women were nothing. They were invisible. Does that happen today as well? Does money matter?
Of course it does. Yeah. It does in different ways, and it's not just the Greek women, it's a lot of the women. I spent a lot of time mentoring young women from my old high school, and these days, back then we're all the Greeks and the Jews, and today's they're all, you know, the young Asian women. They're all Australian in the main. They're Australian born, but they're very different in culture, and so their culture is much more quiet than we were as Greek women. I think we had a much bigger voice. Our mothers taught us to have a voice, and they are quieter. Also, when I speak to some of the girls, we were talking before about cycling. I might go for a bike ride and I'll chat to one of the girls and say, what do you do? Where do you work? And then my next question will be to them, when are you going to be the CEO? And they'll either go, oh no, I'm not going to be the CEO, I don't want that much responsibility. Or they'll giggle and they'll say, well, I don't know. So that then becomes a door for them to open for them to say, well, start looking at being the CEO, because, and you give them permission, you start to talk to them about, well, there's no reason you shouldn't be. You've got the skills, you've got the capabilities, you've got the passion. So it's about letting them open that door to go to that place where they can become the CEOs. I come from the corporate world, so that's my passion, and helping the women find their voice and be non-invisible, so to speak. So, but it's very hard, and there was a recent TV series on with the politicians, and there's one particular scene where they all talk about being in a room full of guys and saying something, and nobody hears them. And
gender deafness?
No, it's an unconscious bias in some ways, but it's also there's just not that security, I put it down to, amongst the guys to say, we can listen to this and we can take it on. And I've been in a room in a boardroom with my co-board directors and said something, and there was peace and quiet for about 2 minutes. And then one of the other guys said exactly the same thing in exactly the same words as I said. And I kind of looked at him and thought, I even was a bit cheeky and turned around and winked at him and said, I couldn't have said it better myself. And he looked at me like, oh my God, what are you talking about, woman? And it was intense. It was just so frustrating. And so what do you do in that situation? Do you find your voice and stamp your hand on the table and say, I just said that? But you won't get anywhere with that because they haven't heard you. You haven't been heard. So yes, we are still invisible in many ways, but no, there are non-invisibilities happening as well. So,
why do you think you grew up with a bigger voice than your Australian friends? Does cultural identity have anything to do with that?
Yes, for me it does. Personally, for me it does. I have a classic story where my mum would introduce me and my brother, and she'd say, "Here's my son, he doctor. Here's my daughter, she not married." Right? Because, you know, I took a while to get on with it, right? Not that it mattered, but, and so I would always have to fight for everything I wanted to do. My brother was allowed to go out, do anything he wanted, but I was the good Greek girl, had to stay at home and do the right thing, learn how to sew, knit, crochet, cook, and study, get degrees, because that way you get a better quality of husband. But, I mean, that's very flippant in the way I'm describing, but it's actually quite true. That's probably how I found I had a bigger voice than some of my contemporaries.
We're not historians here, we're just going to assume. Why do you think the women of the revolution got out there and fought? They sold the ships, they sold the houses to empower the soldiers. What would make a woman that is traditionally invisible under an empire, the Ottoman Empire at the time, to just put herself out there? They knew that they were not going to get recognized, I'm certain.
Well, I don't think if you're passionate and brave and courageous, I don't think you do anything because you want recognition. You do it because you believe in change. And I think they were the incredible change makers. I had the privilege some years ago of being in New York and meeting Gloria Steinem and, you know, listening to her speak, and she was incredible. And she was actually interviewing Sam Morstan, who was 7 or 8 years old 11 at the time, who was playing football and soccer and kind of paving the way. I mean, that, and again, linking it back to the women of the Greek Revolution, that's because there's a burning fire in your belly where you just have to be true to who you are and live your ideals. And I think it's the courage to create change that, and like I said before, that consciousness that then you inherit around what that means and how you know, the behaviors or the way that you make that change happen. And I don't think, again, like we talk about bravery today, you know, our sports stars who are brave, or, you know, I guess your everyday person who is brave, but, you know, maybe in a certain context they are, but these women led the way because they believed that change was critical to the legacy and I guess the heritage, the Greek heritage, and we have that privilege and honour of the fight that inheriting everything that came with those freedoms. Like we explored, I'm, for those of you that don't know, the CEO of Fronditha Care. For the 200 years we explored, you know, 200 Greek Australians, 200 years after the War of Independence, what legacy and identity, what does it mean? You know, why are we here today? I'm born and raised, Melbourne born and raised. Why do I care about the women of the revolution or Greek identity? Because the blood that runs through you is Greek blood.
Is it blue and white?
It's blue and white all the way. And I think it's, no matter, you know, when I think those women fought for change because they had the power and the capacity, because a lot of them that are well recognised, were from wealthy families. So they had the money. They may have died poor and penniless, or stateless even, but they put everything they had into that fight for the freedoms of their compatriots and also their country, so believing in those freedoms. And I think, like Vicky was saying, I think we all, fight that good fight in as far as we can, whether in a boardroom, whether through education, whether championing other women, whether in the workplace, because it's really important to encourage others to find their voice. And I think that that's what they did. And, just because I believe, because, that whole idea that they're somehow homogenous isn't true. And I think that that's the myth of that history, that women were fiercely independent, minds of their own, and they may not have had the trappings that, male colleagues may have had, but in terms of the recognition, but they certainly had the intelligence to be able to make things happen and to live their lives like Manto Mavrogenos, who I believe lived with her partner for many years. So, led the way very, very early on.
Why do we care about the women of the revolution? I'm just going to grab that sentence and throw it at you.
Because they were trailblazers, because they had courage, they were brave enough to make a difference, and they had the wherewithal to do it, or they created the wherewithal. And we care because they did help make that difference. And we have to care because it shows us, it gives us role models. This is some of the things that I talk about. There are very few women as CEOs in Australia and worldwide actually. How come? Because, well, we don't have role models there to go and look at those women and say, I want to be like her. I want to, I see her and I can do it as well. And you need courage to step out from the comfort space. You need someone to have their hand on your back to keep holding you forward and saying to you, you can do it. And they're the kind of conversations that I have with some of the young women, or they're not young all the time, they're even older, and to give them courage and to give them the permission. I'm a great believer, you give permission to someone to do something. Yes, you can go and do that. And the women of the independents, they didn't need the permission, they took it. They had it, they took it. They took a risk, of course, and many of them, as Faye was saying, died in poverty, and they gave up everything because they had nothing else to lose, really.
I want to go to the audience. Varvara, at the moment you're the collective voice of women in the community. You've just written a book called Her Voice, and you've interviewed many prominent women. Firstly, how did you feel growing up as a Greek Australian woman? What was your connection with the revolution? And then, if you can tell us the result of your book, so we can go and read it after.
Well, I didn't grow up here to start off with. I grew up in Greece and I came to Australia as soon as graduated from high school. So my recollection of the Greek Revolution and the history is through the textbooks, and we only learned about Bouboulina and Manto Mavrogenos. They were the two women. Of course, coming from Epirus, I've always known about the Souliotises because my yaya was from Souli, okay? And then the Messalonkitisses. If I can just go back to the women of the revolution, it was an era that women were not celebrated. It was an era that it was male dominated, and the role of women were to help their families, the husbands. And there were all those women that helped and sold their houses. They were very privileged women. They had money. So they've sold everything. And history has done them a disservice. And I'm thinking of Manto Mavrogenos, who really, she's done really badly. Ended up not having anything. She fell in love with, what's the name? I just can't remember now.
Things we do for love.
Yes, and ended up really poor and very badly. Now, in terms of, I just want to pick up some of the points before I get to my book. Vicky talked about the unconscious biases and what happens when she mentors women, right? And you're very lucky that you had a voice, because my mother told me that I shouldn't talk about myself, I shouldn't brag, and I've still got this voice in my head saying, let others speak about you. And in some of the other cultures, like the Asian cultures, women do not talk about themselves, and this Western culture doesn't sit well with their upbringing. Now, the question you ask, are women celebrated, is probably the wrong question. May I?
What is the
I'll tell you why. I think the question that we should be asking is, are culturally and linguistically diverse women or Indigenous women equally represented in positions of power? And the answer is no.
So they were not represented back then, and they're not represented
And they're not
now.
represented.
So
Things are a lot
changed.
better.
Oh,
Things
so
are-
things are better.
Yeah, things are better,
In
but
what
we're
way?
not there yet, and that's what I'm saying in my book. Now, the stories, the women that I've selected to be represented in the book is called Have Voice, Greek Women and Their Friends. I've interviewed about 50 different women, and I've applied the diversity lens, and I try to pick up women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, from all professions, business world, as much intersectionality as one could have in a single publication. Gay women, single women, women that I've brought up with.
So what is that you observed that was common throughout?
A lot
this-
of
this sample?
racism, sexism, but despite all of that, the resilience of them and the will to succeed has helped them to move on. But they've had to work a lot harder, because apart from the gender glass ceiling, they've had the cultural glass ceiling. Some of those women are here, by the way, in the book. Vasu is in the book. Esther is in the book.
So we reached out to the right people.
Yeah.
Vasu, can I ask you a question? You're known around the world. You've done some tremendous things, not just for the community, for everyone. Do you think you've been celebrated enough by our community?
Yes and no. I mean, there's been a lot of jealousy, a lot of hatred to get where I am. I mean, there's half the population hate me, half the population like me, and I don't know why they hate me. Or they don't even know me. I don't even know them, but they hate me. So I think people judge, and they just have this picture of you, and they judge you, and they either like you or hate you. You know what I mean? And you know, I mean, that's the bad side, the hatred and the jealousy. But unfortunately, I see a lot of this hatred and jealousy from women, from fellow women. I mean, they're not happy for your success. You know, oh, there she goes again. She got another award or whatever. You know, and they just hate
I mean,
it.
you've only cured cancer.
But so that's the bad. But then with the bad comes the good, and you know, there is recognition. There is, I've got 100 awards and whatever. So people are recognising what I'm doing. Scientific community, general public, etc.
When you were growing up, did you connect with the women of the revolution? Was that something that was not on your radar? Did you feel that there were role models for you in Greek history?
Well, when we learnt about 1821, it was Kolokotroni. I didn't know anybody else. I didn't know any female in the revolution. I didn't know. That's what we learnt at Greek school. So that's all I learnt. Role models, actually, most of my role models were males, and even I've got mentors, they're males. So I've connected better with males as role models and as mentors, and even now I have mentors and it's a male, not the females are just fine and I don't know why. I mean, there's jealousy, I'm not sure what it is.
I think it's a lack of experience. It's a lack of what I was saying before about being there, practicing it, getting away from the unconscious bias, getting to not even a conscious bias, but to a rhythm, having the ability to do that all the time, for us to be there, to engage with them. And it's interesting, I've got a conversation going on at the moment with some of my girlfriends who I've met through one of the things I've been involved in. We were talking about this before. It's Scale Investors, which is a female-led angel investment group where we only invest in female entrepreneurs. We have scale males as well, as we call them, and what we do there is we've become friends, we've become collaborators, we've become, we talk to each other. I had a phone call on the weekend from someone who, most situations that in a kind of workspace, you don't expect your colleagues to call you on the weekend, but we're not colleagues anymore. We've probably never been colleagues. So it's about having that community of friends and female friends and getting past that jealousy thing, getting past that, oh, she's doing better than me or whatever, and it's celebrating. And I think this is coming back to, it's not that they weren't celebrated, it's just that they weren't known. And I think the stories weren't available, and the men have led the world pretty much most of the time, and that's what people like to hear. That's what they like to talk about. But there's some fantastic things happening. Like one of the things is in sport, cricket. The women's cricket is being played and they're getting paid. And there's a lot of talk about how much they're getting paid. So that equality thing is really important, and calling that out. And I think we're finding the opportunity for more conversations around, well, why isn't that happening? And part of the reason Scale Investors came about was with some leading Victorian women, was to help these young entrepreneurs get funding where they've never been, about 4% of funding goes to women. So it's about changing that, and the government is getting behind that. It's a slow process, but it's working, it's happening. We invest in about 10 to 15 businesses a year, and it varies. I won't go on about it, but it's, I think there's a change happening, so there's a lot of work to do. Because
I think it's interesting when you talk about mentors and, who you consider your mentors. And I guess in my life, I've had both male and female, both professionally. Yeah. So, Vula Mary, who most of you would know, has been an incredible mentor to me, since, when I began my career, and likewise, males in the sector that I grew up in, which is in the public but social sector. And then when I moved into corporate, the same, championed by a lot of, great, mostly men, because they were the ones in the corporate sector, and I was part of the Clemenger group. And like you said, you're in a boardroom with 12 men and there's you. And I guess what was interesting, what had led me to that point, was a lot of desire to make a difference, but naivety to the degree that if I reflect back now and think what pushed me to be in those rooms or in that space was a little bit of chutzpah, but a little bit of ignorance too, because I didn't know what I didn't know, and I was there to learn and to do good work. And I was championed by really great people, but I worked really hard, at each stage to get to the next stage. But I think the birth of that came from my mother and my aunt, who were amazing, but my grandmothers before them. So both my paternal and maternal grandmothers were refugees from Asia Minor. They were orphaned at 12 and 13 years old, but they still went on. They were resettled and they were moved again. It's a very common story. I'm sure most of you, share that story in terms of, your families. But what inspired me, even as a child, knowing their stories, was that despite everything, they got married, they had families, they raised amazing daughters, their daughters raised more daughters, but all with the attitude that you could be or do whatever you wanted to do. But you also...
Mine was different.
Yeah,
so
which is
that's,
a really interesting experience.
Yeah.
It's
the
because you're
same
not married.
Oh,
You were
I
not.
know. Forgot.
But even to be, I mean, I think you still had those cultural expectations, but there was also the expectation, you know, that you would be very well educated, that you would be successful to whatever degree, you know, that was measured, which I think when you look around this room, but generally in the Greek community, when you talk about what is the legacy we've inherited from the women of the revolution, I think it's that you can pave the way, you can pave your own way. It takes courage, it takes bravery, because success does not come easily. You hear it all the time of actors where they're told, oh, you know, you overnight success, and there's no such thing, right? We all know that. But it's that, I think, and I've said this before in other forums, it's backing yourself, of saying, I'm going to do this. I know the journey is hard, the path is hard, being on boards, likewise, but you carve a space for yourself. So I always say that I had a corporate mind, but a social heart. So I've always worked in roles that combine the two, where you bring a corporate business lens to the work that you do, but it has a social outcome for social good, because that was my passion. And I've been able to have the opportunities, you know, throughout my career that have led me now to have the privilege of being the CEO at Fronditha Care. But that was a long time in the making. And, you know, because again, I had the privilege of being the first female president of Fronditha Care in a at that time, it was a 35-year history, which is phenomenal. But my view was, well, at least it happened. At least it happened, right? Like, yeah.
I'm just going to go back to what you said about your grandmothers. And I thought that came to me. Did you ever consider that they were women of the revolution? I mean, they were very close to the struggle for liberation.
Yeah.
It was the aftermath of that.
Well, I'm born and raised in Melbourne, born and raised. I met my grandmothers once on a trip back to Greece, you know, the 6-month holiday, obligatory in the 70s, you know. Spent a whole, you know, a couple of seasons there, met her briefly, not briefly, met her, you know, met one of them and the other one twice, but, you know, again on holiday before they passed away. I guess to me, I didn't think in those grand big terms. I just thought, this is incredible that in one generation, or two generations, the privilege that I have coming from, you know, that I enjoy, with the opportunities that I have had because of the sacrifices of my grandmothers and their, you know, their families, their experience, but my parents too, and my mother, you know, in particular. So I think it's, again, you know, it's how do you measure these successes? How do you measure the glory of that contribution? And I think it's what Vassal was saying before, you know, you can get the accolades, you can get the awards, you can get the positions and the titles. Is that what matters? Because is that your motivation? I'm sure it was never Vassal's motivation. It's nice to have it. It's nice to have your peers, recognition of your peers. It's nice to have, you know, recognition of your colleagues or your mentors or your community. You know, it's really, it's humbling. But I know from myself when I've had that kind of recognition or awards, so it's important in that it gives you a certain gravitas. But is that why I did what I did? Never.
Let's talk about multiculturalism. Does it work?
I haven't given that question much thought, but let me...
What does your gut say?
My gut says, yeah, it does work because people collaborate amongst their groups. I sort of think back to when I was little and my parents, we'd have to go with mum and dad to be translators to the doctors and the lawyers and or whatever they had to go and do to get their passports, whatever they had to do. So, you know, these little 7-year-olds were traipsing along, and you would ask your contemporaries, what do I do? And they would tell you. So that's your culture. They're the people around you that will help you get there. there are other cultures that are in our society at the moment. Well, a good example is the Chinese culture, and they are interesting to look at. Do they work together? Do they not work together? I don't know the answer to that, so I'm still struggling to answer your question. But multiculturalism does, in the Greek community, I think it works. I think it's smoothed out a little bit these days because we've had intermarriages and we don't find that we have to be in every aspect of our lives connected to the Greekness of ourselves or the culture that we come from. So,
is it that it was an empire during the Ottomans that multiculturalism didn't work, and that we're now living in a republic and it's a different system, and that's why communities can coexist? What was it that made the Greeks revolt?
Oh, they wanted their country back. They wanted identity for the place they were living at. If we had to talk about multiculturalism here in the same terms, the closest I think we could come to would be the Indigenous community, because, and they don't have the aggression that the Greeks had during the independence period. So it'd be interesting if we get to that, but I doubt it. We live in a very different world. But I think the Greeks did want their country back, and so they had a deep desire to be connected. But they still had a lot of their infighting. Remember, we had the civil wars and a lot of those sorts of things, and so that's a micro multiculturalism at its best in many ways.
It always shocks me that I'm a child of migrants, that I even learn how to read and write, let alone to get to that level like that. And I'm not kidding. I used to say it think it all the time. You know, how you got to go from that story of people who came with nothing to build a better life to one of the most successful generations of migrants to Australia with real power in our community. I think, I don't know if I've shared this story before, but when I worked at Premier and Cabinet, and this was back in the early 2000s, and I worked on the Racial Religious Tolerance Act introduction, and you know, under Premier Brax at the time, and John Pandazopoulos was Minister assisting, so you know, it was kind of the glory days of multicultural affairs. And I always thought that it was the Jewish community that was the powerful, or the Italian community. And I was, you know, really surprised to find that it was actually the Greek community that was behind a lot of change. Now, and I think again, it goes back to that idea that we have inherited something in our DNA which just drives us above and beyond many other culturally connected, culturally ethnic groups.
Why do you think why Australian multiculturalism works today?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it works for a number of reasons, and that is the policy framework around it. I don't know that it works today, right? So I'm not sure how it is working today, because I think what I mentioned before, everything is a cycle. I think at this point in time, in terms of leadership around social cohesion, in terms of policy around diversity and what that means for a multicultural society, I think, I'm not sure that it works as well as maybe when I became interested in this area and worked in policy and worked, you know, in advocacy, and those that went before me who really lobbied for change and created this pathway that, you know, we now enjoy. I'm not sure that the structures and systems that were put in place in the 70s and 80s through federal, state politicians and leadership, and then policies, and then services and programs that flow from that, it's different. I don't know that it's in some ways as good. I think because the nature of our society is constantly changing, I think the dialectic around it got hijacked by an us and them conversation rather than an us conversation. I did a lot of work when I was at the Clemenger Group on social cohesion, and this was probably 6, 7 years ago, and you could see the fracture in society of people who were very pro multiculturalism and immigration and refugees, and felt an obligation to support diversity in our community.
So that tear in the social fabric, is it the same that it was 200 years ago, or was it poverty that made that more intense?
Well, I think the factors that create impetus for change and revolution, I think, are fundamentally the same. They're core issues of identity, of fighting for freedom, of fighting for independence, of fighting for basic human rights. Like, they fight for human rights, and today's fight around multiculturalism is very much around people's human rights and rights to exist in context of what they identify with, collaboratively in a society. So I think it's, and Vicky mentioned it, we've seen the rise of the voice of First Nations people. They have a very different character, if you like, around their polemic. And I think what makes, communities like the Greek community different, or the Italian or the European communities different, is that we had a stronger sense of self and identity because we weren't nomads, right? And we fought for place, we fought for country. I mean, I'm sure we've all been on planes back to Greece where people kiss the ground as soon as they come out because they're so happy, to have come back home, or likewise to Australia, or where, so it's, I think that, I don't think we live in an experiment anymore around multiculturalism. I think it's a fact. That is who we are. We see the impacts of COVID and locked borders on workforce. You can't survive without migration, right? So by virtue of the fact that Australia needs population and we're not producing it here, naturally, you have to bring it in.
It's
now,
a whole new conversation.
Who those people are that want to call Australia home because they see it as an opportunity, is different to who it was in generations past, but their desire to call another place home comes from that, I think, desire of what I described before in my grandparents and parents around a better life.
Vicky, you said oppression. If oppression is the foundation of revolution, are women the key to revolution? Women are the biggest part of our society that are literally oppressed.
About 52%
so
of the
many parts of the world
are female, and they are oppressed. And to extend to the conversation around the multiculturalism, when our parents, I think most of us, our parents first came to Australia, we had little groups of people, and I remember when other cultures were moving in, my mum would say, "What do they want here in our country?" And it was like, "Well, Mum, you're a foreigner." No, I'm not. I'm Australian. And in her best Greek, not even in her best English. And so to go back to the oppression question about, are women oppressed? In many ways they are. I have conversations. My husband is the biggest detractor of feminism or, progression of women that you could find. So he says to me all the time, "You've got such a chip on your shoulder." And I say, "No, I don't. I'm very well balanced. I have a chip on each shoulder. I'm very good." But he says, forget about any man trying to get a board position these days. They're all going to the women. And I know that's rubbish because I've seen it in play. I see it. So there's all these other things that come into play about this is talking to your oppression, right? That is, for a female to get on a board these days, she has to have the exact skills that's on that job description that she's been talked to, that she's been interviewed for, and then everything else. Some of those things are definitely changing. And what's also happening is personally for me, but also amongst my contemporaries, we're finding our comfort. We're losing, or at times losing, that imposter syndrome where I had someone say to me my husband said to me the other day, "You have no idea about finance." I said, "I have a big idea about finance, but I don't have a minor idea about finance. I have a big idea about everything else. And I'm never hired on boards to be the finance guru. That is not what my skill set is. That is not where I grew up. But I do have to have some mainstream capability. So there, and I'm getting into fine space of, you know, the oppression in, because that's the place I know, the corporate space. And the women are not getting selected because there's this big influx of conversation around we have to have women on board. Yes, they are going there and the skill sets are there, but what's missing a lot of the time is that acute experience. So there's a lot of work to do to get back to, you know, what we were talking about before, having the role models, having experience, having mentors, having people open the doors for you, having those conversations.
Can I ask your opinion? Do you think there are two buckets of white women and women of color? Just like back in the revolution, we had rich women and poorer women. Is that the case? We read a lot about that. What is your personal experience?
There is, but that's shifting as well. That is definitely shifting. I meet a lot of women that want to chat, you know, get guidance, and they're not white, blonde, Anglo-Saxon types at all. They are there too. And some of them, my best friends are like that as well, and because that's who they are. I mean, you know, the other thing is, we don't get up, as a woman, I don't get up every day and go, oh, I'm a woman and there's a particular way I have to behave today when I go to work, when I go to the gym or the supermarket or at home. We're a person. So this is the whole part of it. That's, you know, I've lived with an unconscious bias all my life where I'm me. And so why do I get labelled as a woman? Because that's how I'm seen. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I kind of like being a woman, so it's not that bad.
You get to wear better clothes.
I know that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but I don't mean it that way. I mean, we don't have to be the bloke.
Mm. I agree completely.
I interrupted you before. What was your comment?
I was just going to say, look, you see, it all depends, and Vicky talked about this, what space you want to play in, right? So there are lots of women in the multicultural space who are leaders. You see them represented if anyone watches The Drum. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of commentators, and kudos to ABC for starting to show that diversity, right? So not of LGBTQI only community, but also of Sudanese women, Muslim women, like you see it. They've got Muslim reporters now on ABC. So they're paving the way.
I have the question for that. Are we too white to be diverse as Greeks?
Well, I feel like I am. So, and this is where you find yourself.
We're racist within our own
Yeah, we're
space,
very ethnocentric.
right? So
But I think I found it in myself when you were talking before, because I'm of that age group where you weren't the trailblazers in the racism, anti-racism, advocacy and lobby for change, right? Because I came a generation before. But then I'm not, you know, a woman of colour or an Asian woman or, you know, you know, you fit a particular thing. Is that bother me? No. I have so much privilege.
Does it bother you?
No, it doesn't. In fact, I have a very close Greek girlfriend who's changed her maiden name from a beautiful Greek name to a beautiful non-Greek name. And we've had fierce arguments. I've said to her, if you ever have this conversation with me again, I will never speak to you again. And I'm the godmother of her son. And she says to me, you need to change your name from Paparchristos to your husband's name, Peters. And, you know, I grew up in my teens and my 20s going, oh my God, I need to get married to get rid of this bloody surname. And then one day I had this epiphany and thought, oh my God, I'm multicultural, tick that box. I'm female, tick that box. So do I go get a suntan? That's really very un-PC. But in all seriousness, I don't need to be have an Anglo-Saxon surname anymore because I'm comfortable with that and it's accepted, it's desired. Does it mean that I'm going to get those roles? And then getting away from the female diversity, getting into the LGBTIQ, etc. No, it's not queer. It's getting into that other category. On boards, you can't tell. You cannot tell. I'm on a board where the diversity on the board is much more than most boards, but nobody can see it. Right? So how do you, and you know, the ASX doesn't measure that because they don't know how, or people don't want to talk about it so openly. And so the quotas that are being called on are really important, and really, like I get asked all the time, do you believe in quotas? And my answer is yes, because unless you have a platform from which to work from and to, you're never going to get there. Or you're going to struggle to get there, and then it'll get too hard. And one of the things is a lot of women opt out. Part of the reason they're not still in the C-suite or going to the C-suite is because they're tired of pushing that barrel. And they go, you know what, I can do something else that's a lot more interesting. And so some of the more successful startups we've seen and worked on are much more mature women who have worked really hard. They know how to run businesses, they know what to do, and now they're doing it for themselves. So it's a whole other conversation.
And things are changing. In terms of name change, I've had a lot of women in the network that have had to change their name. One of them is a pilot. When she applied, this is a long time ago, she sent 2 resumes, one with a Greek name and the other one with an Anglo name, exactly the same, and she got recruited with an Anglo name.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But these days, a lot of people, you know, are very proud of their identity, and especially the Greek. If I'm reflecting back now 20 years down the track since I've founded Food for Thought Network, I think it's cool to be Greek today. A lot of Greek women are really proud of their identity, and they're really, really good.
I just want to go back to the question of multiculturalism and Australia's First Nations, because I think multiculturalism is the norm. Monoculturalism is what people who are threatened by cultural diversity try to reinstate. And so the revolution was a time of having a particular kind of culture which was oppressive for all sorts of people, in power for quite some time, and then this, moment of fracturing, and we'll talk a lot about the culture of that soon. But when we think about Australia's First Nations, this was a multicultural continent since time immemorial. There are hundreds of First Nations. We are here on the lands of the Boonwurrung, the Bunurong, and the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people. This is Melbourne contested land. There have been all sorts of, myths and sometimes misconceptions, because we haven't, and many of our generations and older than us, we haven't all been educated and listened to elders. So there is a pervasive misconception about nomadic cultures, that First Nation people are not nomadic. They have extremely deep connections to country, which is something that we can all learn from. There's often a misperception around aggression or not being aggressive. Just like any other culture, there are aggressive First Nations groups. There are calm and quiet. There are creative. There was all sorts of resistance to the culture, to the frontier wars, and a lot of those stories aren't being told as well. So when we reflect on Australia's First Nations, I think it's not about us putting our multiculture or our Greek culture alongside that or making that comparison, but this is the foundation of Australia's multiculturalism. And so when we talk about women and the revolution there, I think it was possibly, was it Faye or Vicky who said that the language of multicultural, it's all been co-opted different times with all of Faye's policy work. Absolutely. I think multiculturalism, cultural diversity, it's language that's sometimes used in a failed attempt, it will continue to fail, in an attempt to, sideline and marginalise multiculturalism, which is always already mainstream. It is the strength that we have. And when we talk about, others othering us, they are in the position that is going to fail, not us.
And I just want to add to that as well, because I'm learning as well. There's so much lost history that we have as settlers here in this country. Yes. And that's a shared lost history.
Yes.
And I've only learnt recently about the frontier wars and the deep roots that people had here and the 400 nations that we've come here to learn about. So it is, multiculturalism was built with the premise of a utopia. And it has been not only co-opted, but it's been vandalised as well recently. And whether it's through political aspirations and deep, deep racism, that it's something that we need to take back somehow. And as settlers, particularly with coming from our parents with a refugee background, I think there's an opportunity for us to reflect and learn, and First Nations first, absolutely. Because remember, this is a country that was colonised and built on genocide. And going back to the women of the Greek Revolution, they may have been wealthy, but they saw oppression. They saw everything from culture taken away from them. They saw atrocities, and they dealt with the horror of war and oppression. So that gives people their fighting spirit, and we absolutely see that. For the women in this room, I guess, we've got that spirit within us, but also absolutely within First Nations and the matriarchy that we see, and the leaders that I'm so inspired to know and learn from in my older years. I'll be 60 next year. So this is the time where I'm educating myself. It's the Greek genes, babes.
When the revolution happened, most of the men, they were away. So the women, they had the opportunity to show leadership. And I believe it still continue to be the same.
Around the world.
Yes, and here is the same, and everywhere. Because the tradition or what we learn is that the leader is the man. And slowly, we had to change that. And it still need a lot of work, but it's happening.
What was it like in Cyprus?
In Cyprus, what I know is that after 1955, after
the British.
Yes,
rule.
the British revolution in Cyprus, a lot of Cypriot women managed to do a lot of things and show a big leadership. And after that, they started to go to schools and be more educated. And it was like they had the opportunity to show what they can do. I think around the world, even for the people that they came here in Australia as for a better life, they were looking for opportunities. So I think it's a very important word. And when we have the opportunity, how many times we heard from men that I never thought that I will do this heroic thing. But the house was burning, so I had to go and suddenly he became a hero because he had the opportunity to show the leadership.
So my background, I'm an architect, and I've been working as a project manager for maybe 25 years. So I deliver large community buildings. And I work in an environment where it's mainly men. And what I have learnt to do is to celebrate my successes and to be very vocal of my successes. So when I deliver a good project, I don't sit back. I say, this is what I have done, and this is what we have all done together collaboratively.
Growing up with a very strong Greek woman and two strong Greek sisters, that was my life. So hearing about the oppression and striving for success was the norm for me. So listening to Vera speaking about your interactions with other women, or hearing about the way you are dealt with, or how you deal with men in the boardrooms, it really makes me want to shrink back and go, how have I contributed to that behaviour, and what have I done to change that behaviour? I'm an educator at the moment working with schools of intellectually disabled students, and my goal is to make those girls strive for success and make the boys support them, because I think the only way for women to have an equal voice in the industries they choose is for the boys to support them. So it's now very gender equal, gender balanced, because you shouldn't your successes shouldn't be based on your sexuality or your gender identity. There's a male growing up with two very strong sisters. I support that.
I have a very different experience regarding women, women that they are loud, because I grew up in Greece, and my mother was equal voice, had an equal voice to other women. So she didn't have. So I think that the experience of women here in Australia is like they are women, but also they come from a multicultural background, and actually this is their identity, and this is how it produces, and this is how it manifested to being a loud and strong women. I think most women that I've met here in the Greek community, they are very, very strong, and they're not afraid to voice their opinions. However, in Greece, and it goes back to the monocultural, this is what I didn't like in Greece, that it's very monocultural.
It's slowly changing.
It's
though.
slowly. The last, I haven't been in Greece for 10 years, so it's slowly changing.
Right?
Yes. But I think that in Greece, the other problem we had, it was like, so my mother was the one that was cooking, was cleaning, doing everything. And with the boys, because we were two boys, it never occurred to us that we had to do some of these things, because my mother never asked for. So when I came to Australia, and I'm married, of course it's half-half. Maybe 60-40 if my wife, if my wife has to do some studying or anything. And that's what I want to pass to my daughters as well. Like, it's not like you have to do everything. You have to do your fair share, being a woman, being in a family, and actually being a mother and a wife.
I guess I grew up in a household where my father did all the cooking and cleaning, so it was really, I wasn't really exposed to that interpretation that you're a female, so therefore you're very limited. And I've really taken on that philosophy. I'm an academic, and I really do, I guess, interpret and apply a really inclusive pedagogy for my students. So for me, it's really accepting and celebrating each student and empowering each person within my class to do what it is that they want to do, regardless if they're Greek, Italian, Asian, black, white, yellow, blue. That to me is irrelevant. And I think the message that I try and bring across to my students is that feel empowered, feel celebrated, and you have the right to do whatever it is that you want to do. You want to finish your postgraduate degree, you want to do a PhD, you don't want to do it, that's your right. But for me, the most important message, I guess, that I try and also model is that do what you feel is right for you. What is your goal? What is your common goal? How can I facilitate for you to reach that goal, which is what is important. And on that theme of multiculturalism, absolutely loved what you guys said. And it's when we apply that myopic interpretation of what we believe multiculturalism is, then we get into trouble. We then impose our interpretation, which might be not as inclusive as what it should be. And I think, again, within the classroom, I've got students that are school-age students, I've got mature-age students, I've got students that are international that really can't speak much English, and I try and encourage each of them to work cooperatively, and it seems to work.
I was just thinking about, before, I don't know why, but I thought about money, and I thought, because we were talking about the women from the revolution, most of them that were successful or are known had a lot of money. And I have those conversations with a lot of the young women. I say to them, you need to make money, because that gives you freedom to make changes and to push the world in a different way, in a positive way. And that's an interesting conversation to have with young women and older women, because generally we don't talk about things. So I say to them, go and find out what all the guys are earning at work, and if you're not earning as much as them in your category, then you need to go and get a pay rise, and I'll come and talk to me about how to get a pay rise, and we'll work through that. And their anxiety, just with that simple conversation, is intense. So how do you change that and keep moving forward, getting the oppression of being grateful for having a job where you're doing as much, if not better, than the bloke next to you, and they're getting paid more than you, and you're okay with that, is not okay with me.
I think it's great to have the opportunity to be with people that, you know, some that you know, some that you don't, to exchange ideas and to understand the world a little bit differently.
You know, I've been thinking that maybe things would have been different if Bubulina and Mavrogenos had an incubator or they had media. However, they had art. About art, we'll talk in our next episode next week. See you soon. Kalinichta.
They had this, you know, really fabricated, confected notion of the Greeks of a long, long time ago that they had to come in and save. So art drove them to revolution and to war.
I can't think any way that any piece of art could be easily communicated throughout Greece at that time.
And it wasn't until many years later that I looked at folk art and what art represented amongst the people that my ideas of heroism changed.
And the only reason I've seen any art about the 1821 revolution is because I went to Greek school and it got shoved down my throat, which was good and bad.
A whole chorus of men looking down at you. And I often think to myself, where are the women in these stories?
And I saw that as incredible oppression, because if I was to say to my daughters, you know, sit there for 3 years and embroider your prika, you know, they'd be out of the door.
Art empowers people. Art makes the courage rise, you know, into our hearts and inspires us to act. Art makes the, you know, the tears well in our eyes and the laughter, you know, dance in our bellies.